Thank you for joining us again here as we examine verse by verse the book of Ruth. We have seen in Ruth chapter 1 how Ruth lost her husband and her two sons, but one of her daughters-in-law returned to Israel after a famine with her to the city of Bethlehem. And we saw Naomi was very upset, was very deep in grief, was very bitter. She was angry at God. She thought God was against her. I guess it's implied that she's angry. But Ruth is new to the faith in following the Lord. And then we see in Ruth chapter 2, Ruth has been studying scripture and she goes out to a field. God leads her to a field, and it is Boaz's field. Boaz is referred to in verse 1 of chapter 2 as a very worthy man, which means he was a man of great honor, a valiant man, and he's faithful. And he takes care of Ruth. He allows her to come up and get some of the good grain. He tells his workers to pull out some of the grain they've already gathered for him and leave it behind specifically for Ruth to be able to gather and take back. He lets her drink from the water that's been drawn by his workers. He lets her eat the food that has been provided for his workers to take care of her, and gives her a doggy bag to take back to Naomi. And when Ruth goes back to Naomi, Naomi is shocked with how much Ruth shows up with, both the grain and the leftover food. And so Naomi recognizes that Boaz is what she calls a kinsman redeemer. And now in this chapter 3, we're going to look at here, we're going to get into some specifics of what Scripture says about that phrase. So let's start in chapter 1 here or verse 1 of chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you? And may it be well with you." So Naomi wants Ruth to find rest and be able to experience a good life. Ruth had been taking care of Naomi, and so Naomi wanted to make sure Ruth was also taken care of. She wanted Ruth to be safe. She wanted Ruth to be secure, especially when so much around them during this time of the judges was neither safe nor secure. Verse 2. Is not Boaz, our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. So it's Boaz's turn at the threshing floor. Undoubtedly, the landowners out in the field would take turns out in the threshing floor of removing the good parts of the grain from the throwaway parts, of the sheaves. And it was Boaz's turn. Well, I got a picture here of a threshing floor from that time period. You can notice in this picture, a little fence has been built around this, but typically these threshing floors were wide, open, flat spaces. They were sometimes exposed bedrock or slick polished stone. There were various ancient methods of winnowing, such as beating the grain with a stick, tossing it to the wind, or guiding animals to walk on it and pull the heads of the grain out, or leading animals as they dragged a threshing sledge over the top of the crops to force out the heads of grain. Which, if you look in this picture, in the foreground there, the front middle section, is a threshing sledge that the sheaves would be laid across or drug across with something heavy on top. Like I mentioned a minute ago, possibly the animals dragging something across the sheaves on top of that threshing sledge with those little holes there. The heads of grain, the good parts, would fall down through those holes and be gathered into something. Well, we know from the previous chapter in verse 17 of Ruth chapter 2 that Ruth apparently used a stick to winnow her barley, which would not have been taking very much time, as her harvest, what she had gathered, was relatively small compared to the entirety of Boaz's field. And the winnowing of an entire field, Boaz's field, it would undoubtedly have taken a significant amount of time, which may have been the reason that Boaz was out there so late at night working. Look at verse 3. Naomi is still talking to Ruth. She tells her, "Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." So Naomi told Ruth to clean herself up and make herself look nice, and to anoint herself. Anointing, in the sense used here, was something typically done on special occasions, such as holidays or during festivals. She was supposed to wear a cloak, which the translation could also be of a large cloak, possibly to further disguise her identity beyond just the darkness of the night. And that may have been, it seems to have possibly been Naomi's intention to keep Ruth disguised so no one recognizes who she is. She didn't want Ruth to be recognized by passersby or people from the city, except by Boaz, and then only after he had settled in for the night. Verse 4, Naomi says again, she says, "But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Now, some commentators suggest the phrase "uncover his feet" means something immoral. However, nothing in Scripture or in ancient accounts justifies such an interpretation. The Hebrew words for uncover and feet mean uncover and feet. They mean exactly what they're translated to mean. So there's no other instance of potential meaning hidden in the words other than somebody trying to imply something that is not there. And it may actually end up saying more about the interpreter than the passage itself. So to take the scripture as it reads is to understand it to mean that Ruth was told by Naomi to simply follow Boaz, and when he goes to sleep, uncover his feet, allow his feet to be open to the coolness of the air. And possibly the coolness of the uncovered feet then would wake him, and he would discover Ruth at his feet, which was a position of humility, of request. And Naomi knew that this act would wake Boaz eventually. And being notified then of his opportunity as the kinsman redeemer, she also knew that he would know exactly what to do and exactly what Ruth needed to do. So look at verse 5. "And she replied, all that you say, I will do." That's Ruth talking to Naomi. "And she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her." You see, Ruth trusts Naomi. She had full faith in the renewed faith of Naomi. Even though the instructions were undoubtedly nerve-wracking for Ruth, she did everything that Naomi wanted her to do without wavering. She had seen Naomi at her worst, at her lack of faith, in her grief, in her struggle, in her bitterness. But here, she trusts Naomi, and so she goes down there through the dead of night, out there to Boaz. Verse 7. "And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down." So, having worked to winnow as much of the harvest as could be done at this time, Boaz had his dinner and he laid down with the separated grain, most likely in an effort to protect it from thieves. Remember, this was during the near lawless time of the judges when everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes, most often to the detriment of whomever else it might impact. And so Boaz is out there laying down with his grain, making sure no one steals it. Verse 8. "At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, 'Who are you?' And she answered, 'I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer.'" So his feet had been uncovered. And most assuredly, out there in the open air, it would have been chilly. And he turns over, possibly attempts to cover his cold feet, only to discover that someone is right there by his feet, which is a shock. I mean, I can remember many times when my kids were little and they would come and wake me up in the middle of the night, wake my wife up in the middle of the night, and they're standing, 2 feet from our face, and it's kind of a shock. It is abrupt, and your adrenaline's pumping, and you're like, oh, there's somebody in my face. And so this is what Boaz experiences. He wakes up in the night, he's cold, he covers his feet, and then quickly realizes there is somebody by his feet. And he doesn't recognize Ruth. She's been with him and his workers for weeks, possibly a couple months, but he doesn't recognize her. Well, it's the middle of the night, and Boaz, trying to suppress his adrenaline, he wakes up enough to figure out what's going on, and then Ruth makes this very interesting request to Boaz. Back in chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz had made the observation to Ruth that she had taken refuge under the wings of the Lord. So having placed herself under the wings of the Lord, she now asks Boaz if she can place herself under his wings. She tells him to spread his wings over her because he is her redeemer. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, God makes the same comment about spreading wings, speaking symbolically of marrying Israel. So it appears that the phrase spread his wings, it's a cultural idiom intending a potential marriage, or to use a more modern concept, Ruth seems here to be proposing marriage to Boaz. Or I guess more accurately, she's asking Boaz to propose to her, I guess. She's using the cultural custom of the kinsman redeemer as her opportunity to potentially marry Boaz. And all of that is very interesting because the regulations for a redeemer, they're outlined in Scripture. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 25 through 30. It tells us that every tribe and clan, which was a subdivision of a tribe, and every family, which was a subdivision of a clan, they were to be assigned specific land to serve as their inheritance of the promised land that would pass from generation to generation. And that land was never meant to pass into the hands of another tribe or even possibly another clan. So if the possession of that land was ever lost for whatever reason, such as difficult financial times and the people had to sell their land to buy food, then the next closest member of the family or clan, or even just the tribe itself, if another member of the family or clan was not found, they would be responsible to keep the property in the family, or keep the property in the clan, or at the most general, keep the property in the tribe. This rule also applied to a family who had sold themselves into slavery in order to alleviate debt. And in that case, the kinsman redeemer would be called on to pay the debt to redeem the family member from slavery. That's Leviticus 25, 47 through 55. And this kind of idea, it also applied to vengeance for murdered family members. Numbers chapter 35, verses 19 through 27, as well as debts that were owed to deceased family members. Numbers chapter 5, verse 8. Then the debt that was owed would be paid to the kinsman redeemer, the next closest family member. And so it seems that the kinsman redeemer is meant to look out for, care for, and take responsibility for family members. But what is especially interesting is that when Scripture describes this role, there is no mention of a Levirate marriage being one of the responsibilities of the kinsman redeemer. And the Levirate marriage is when someone dies before having a child, then their brother or another family member would take the wife of the deceased and would have a child with that woman in order to bear the family name and inheritance of the dead family member. And so it would seem here that in the understanding of the book of Ruth, what's happened during this period of the Judges is there may have been a merging of the cultural concepts during this particular time in Israel's history. So that taking a childless widow of a family member as a wife so as to produce a child to bear the name of a family member, the family member who died, it has become a part of the responsibility of the Redeemer. Now, there is no extensive description by Naomi in the previous chapter or here in this chapter by Ruth or Boaz about the kinsman redeemer. So they all understood what was expected by the Redeemer. And the author of the book assumes that the reader either has a full knowledge of the kinsman redeemer during this time, or that the reader is entirely capable of doing that research on their own. And so we have. Naomi, she has sent Ruth to Boaz to remind him of his redeemer responsibilities for the sake of Ruth. She had said in verse 1 that she wanted Ruth to experience rest, to experience refuge, to experience a good life. And Naomi saw the kinsman redeemer responsibility as an opportunity for Ruth to receive this very thing. Look at verse 10. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. So he uses that my daughter phrase again, possibly because he's older, possibly simply because she is uh, a young woman. But either way, he says it. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. So Boaz prays for the Lord to bless Ruth here because he feels as though she is showing him a great kindness to consider him as a candidate for marriage, considering what would be an apparent age gap. He seems to be implying that she could easily have married any man that she would have wished, especially a younger man. He didn't consider himself as eligible for the opportunity of marrying her. The scripture gives no indication also that Boaz is married to someone else or that he had been married to someone else. As best we can tell, he is single and he is older than was typical for someone during that period of time to not be married. He's not, but he is of the level of humility to have not even considered the possibility of the kinsman redeemer so as to take Ruth as his own wife. He's again demonstrating the faithfulness to the Lord by the humility and the honor that he's demonstrating. He calls Ruth, now here's that phrase, a worthy woman. The word for worthy used here for Ruth was used of Boaz in chapter 2, verse 1. So they are both honorable. They are both above reproach. He is seen that way. She is seen that way. They have been prepared by God for each other for such a time as this. Verse 12. And now, this is again Boaz still talking. It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Boaz already knew that he was a redeemer for Ruth's family, but had not yet tried to redeem her. It's easy to say that maybe he hadn't redeemed Ruth yet because there was another family member who had a closer connection and thus a better legal claim towards redemption. This is possible. However, as soon as Boaz is told by Ruth that she's willing for him to be the redeemer, he springs into action to make sure that he will be the one to redeem her. He actually will not rest the next day until he's able to accomplish the task. He does it right off the bat, first thing in the morning. So then it would serve to reason that Boaz doesn't act on his claim to redeem Ruth because he doubts that she would seriously want him to be the redeemer. It seems from what he tells Ruth that it would also be good if this other family member were to be a redeemer. But Boaz presents the possibility of redemption to the man, we're going to see in the next chapter. He presents it in such a way to ensure that he will not agree to it. Maybe he doesn't want to get Ruth's hopes up too high. Maybe he doesn't want to get his own hopes up too high. For whatever reason, he reiterates to Ruth that there is a very real possibility that this other guy will be the Redeemer, all the while knowing he is going to do everything that he possibly can to make sure that he himself will be the Redeemer. Look at verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another, and he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Boaz had told her to stay at the threshing floor while it was still the dead of night. Was possibly for the very same reason he was sleeping with the winnowed crops to begin with. There are very many evil people about during this time period, and he did not want anyone to steal his harvest, and similarly, he did not want anyone to harm Ruth. So he had told her to stay there under his protection. Then he has her get up and leave before it's bright enough to recognize anyone from a distance. Boaz's integrity did not want to present even the image of impropriety. He told her to go home at a time when no one would recognize her so that no one would think anything improper about her. Verse 15. And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. Now, we're not told what kind of measure he uses to scoop out some barley for Ruth. And I can't tell you how many pages of commentaries I read of guys trying to figure out, read between the lines, how much this was here. But it doesn't tell us because we're not supposed to know, because it's not important. He just measured it, 6 measures. It's a significant amount, it's a good amount, but it would also not be so much that she would have trouble carrying it back. And, he probably just scooped it with his hands, most likely, just scoops it out and drops it in there. And so the next natural question is, why 6? Why not 7? 7 is the perfect number. But most likely, that's all she could carry in what she had with her. And so he just scoops out as much as will fit. Verse 16. And she came to her mother-in-law and she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her that all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." Now, the image we get of Naomi here seems to be that maybe she was waiting up for Ruth to return so that she could hear how it all went. And so Ruth walks in and Naomi asks, "So how'd it go?" And Ruth gives Naomi the full rundown of the entire interaction with Boaz, and then says that he gave her all of that barley as a gift for Naomi. Now, notice that. Boaz had said he gave the gift of barley for Naomi, which is interesting. He didn't give it for Ruth specifically. He gave it for Naomi. And Naomi seems to take this gesture as the possible sign for which it was intended. Maybe it was a pledge. Maybe it was a bride price. Maybe it was a promise that I will settle this and we will be married. Because look at what Naomi says next. And she replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." See, Naomi seems to understand something. In response to the gift of barley, she says that Boaz will get it taken care of that very day. They won't need to wait around for a waiting period or a time of contemplation or consultation. Naomi took the gift of grain as a pledge from Boaz that Ruth's redemption would be completed before the day was done. So try to imagine for a sec Ruth's emotions with all that had transpired from the night before until now, hearing these words from Naomi. One way or another, she will be married, or at least pledged to be married, that very day. And that's a whirlwind of actions and emotions. But Naomi is not fazed. It would seem that her faith has not just been renewed, but it has been strengthened and solidified beyond her desperation from chapter 1. And so while we all may have times of grief and confusion, what matters is whether or not we persevere into a stronger faith or we crumble under the weight of this world. Now, thank you for checking out here Ruth chapter 3. Please join us next time as we finish out the book of Ruth and go verse by verse through Ruth chapter 4.